In the misty mountains of Oaxaca, there stands an ancient convent that has guarded one of New Spain's most disturbing mysteries for over 3 centuries. On the night of October 23rd, 1698, a young novice named Beatriz Mendoza vanished without a trace, just hours before taking her perpetual vows. Official records describe her disappearance merely as Sister Beatriz, absent by divine will. But hidden documents, buried for centuries, reveal a far darker truth, one of blackmail, abuse of power, and a vengeance that turned devotion into horror. What truly happened that night would forever change the history of that sacred place. Before continuing with the story of Beatriz Mendoza, I ask you for something important. If you are one of those brave souls who dare to face the unknown, subscribe now and tell me from which country or city you're listening. Few are willing to hear what we reveal here, and even fewer dare to believe it. Now, let me take you back to those days to uncover the full, terrible truth. The convent of Santa Clara of Oaxaca rose proudly on the outskirts of the colonial city, a fortress of volcanic stone that seemed to blend with the mountains around it. Built in 1650 by Franciscan monks, the complex housed 42 cloistered nuns, all from the region's most prominent families. Back then, sending a daughter to a convent not only promised salvation for her soul, it also brought social prestige, and sometimes offered a convenient escape from unwanted marriages or costly dowries. Life within those stone walls followed a rhythm that never changed. Days began before dawn with matins, followed by long hours of prayer, manual labor, and study of the scriptures. The day ended with compline, as night fell over the cloister. Silence was sacred, broken only by the echo of Gregorian chants rising from the chapel, voices that floated toward heaven like incense. At the head of the convent was Mother Superior Catalina de Los Angeles, a 60-year-old woman who ruled with an iron hand. For 40 years, she had dedicated her life to maintaining discipline and spiritual purity within those walls. Her face, carved by deep wrinkles from fasting and sleepless nights, inspired as much reverence as fear among the sisters. They said she could sense an impure thought just by looking into a novice's eyes. It was into this world of unyielding devotion that Beatriz Mendoza arrived in the spring of 1696. She was just 16 when her parents, wealthy merchants from Oaxaca City, offered her to religious life. Even under the austere habit of a novice, her beauty drew attention. Hair as black as obsidian, eyes the color of green glass that seemed to hide secrets, and a smile that, according to chronicles of the time, could brighten even the darkest corridors of the convent. But it wasn't her beauty that truly distinguished Beatriz. It was her mind, sharp, curious, and questioning. From her very first days, she began to wonder about things other novices simply accepted as divine law. Why were the sisters allowed to see their families only once a year? Why were certain books forbidden, even for theological study? And why did wealthy families' donations seem to buy privileges that contradicted the vow of poverty? Her questions, innocent at first, soon made the authorities uneasy. Mother Catalina, who was used to docile novices obeying without question, saw in Beatriz a potential threat to the order she had built. Yet, the generous dowry paid by the Mendoza family made it impossible to dismiss her without serious financial consequences. Then came Fray Domingo Vasquez, the convent's confessor, a 45-year-old Franciscan priest from Spain, small eyes, perpetually sweaty hands, and a nervous habit of rubbing them together when he spoke. From the very first confession, Fray Domingo showed a particular interest in the young novice. What was supposed to be a 15-minute confession often stretched to over an hour whenever Beatriz entered the booth. The other sisters began to notice. No one dared to speak openly, but whispers spread through the corridors like incense during Mass. The convent's strict routine occasionally allowed the presence of outside workers, men hired to repair walls, tend gardens, or maintain the old stone structures. Among them was Miguel Herrera, a 24-year-old carpenter whose skilled hands and honest character had earned him the trust of several prominent families in the region. He came from humble origins, the son of a peasant family from a nearby village, but his work spoke for him. When heavy rains damaged the convent's window frames, Miguel was chosen to make the repairs. By coincidence, or perhaps by something darker that would later be called destiny, Beatriz had been assigned to supervise the restoration work. Normally, such tasks were reserved for older, more experienced nuns, but her discipline and keen eye for organization made her the exception. During those quiet afternoons, while Miguel worked in the sunlight that filtered through the stone arches and Beatriz recorded the damages in her notebook, a subtle connection began to form between them. One neither of them fully understood, yet neither could ignore. The first sign that something unusual was happening came in the form of a letter. It was autumn 1697. Sister Esperanza, the nun in charge of inspecting all correspondence that entered or left the convent, discovered an envelope with no recipient's name. Written in handwriting she instantly recognized as Beatriz's. At first glance, the letter seemed innocent, even pious. But between the lines lay something dangerous, something that stirred suspicion in anyone reading with a careful mind. My heart burns with a devotion that the rules of this place cannot contain. I dream of the day when I may serve God in the way He truly desires. Stone walls cannot imprison a soul that has found its true purpose. Sister Esperanza, a 50-year-old widow turned nun, had absolute loyalty to Mother Catalina. She carried the letter straight to the Mother Superior. The meeting took place in Catalina's austere office, lit only by 2 candles, with a single carved wooden crucifix watching from the wall, its ivory eyes gleaming in the flickering light. After reading the letter a 3rd time, Mother Catalina's hands trembled slightly as she declared, "This young woman has been touched by the demon of pride. We must act before her influence spreads." That very night, Beatriz was summoned to the office. According to later testimonies, Sister Esperanza stood silently in a corner as witness while the encounter stretched for over 2 hours. At first, the conversation was calm, but soon voices were raised. The other sisters heard Beatriz's cries echoing through the stone halls. "You cannot force me to confess sins I have not committed. God knows the purity of my heart better than you ever could." Mother Catalina's response was a long, cold silence. Then, in a low voice, she whispered words that would haunt Beatriz for the rest of her short life. "My child, in this place, the will of God reveals itself through obedience. Those who forget that truth face consequences beyond earthly discipline." The next morning, Beatriz appeared at Mass with a pale face and dark circles under her eyes. Her hands trembled as she held her prayer book, her lips moving in silent whispers that sounded more like desperate pleas than devout prayer. It was Sister Maria del Carmen, a young nun of 25 who had grown close to Beatriz, who first noticed the change. During their brief moments of recreation, she approached her friend, finding her alone by the cloister's fountain, staring at the mountains beyond the stone walls. "Sister Beatriz," she whispered softly, "what troubles you? Your face carries a sorrow no prayer can lift." Beatriz turned to her, and Maria del Carmen would later say she would never forget that look, a mixture of terror, despair, and something else she could not name. "There are things in this place," Beatriz murmured, "things that defy everything we call sacred. but to speak of them would condemn me to something far worse than excommunication. That conversation took place on October 15th, 1698, exactly 8 days before the disappearance. In the days that followed, strange events began to unfold within the convent. Small, unsettling things that eroded the rhythm of prayer and silence. The first occurred during the weekly confessions. Fray Domingo broke his usual schedule and requested that Beatriz confess last. Her session lasted over 2 hours. When she finally emerged, her face was ghostly white, her lips trembling. Sister Esperanza, ever watchful, noticed the priest's robe soaked with sweat and his hands shaking as he put away his stole. For the first time since arriving at the convent, Fray Domingo stayed in the chapel after confessions, kneeling before the altar for more than an hour, as if praying for forgiveness from a sin no one else could see. The second incident came 3 days later in the vegetable garden. Beatriz had been sent there to gather food for dinner when Miguel Herrera arrived to repair the fence. Sister Augustina, who supervised the garden work, observed an exchange that made her uneasy. Miguel asked Beatriz to hold a wooden plank for him, a harmless request, but in that brief moment their eyes met, and something passed between them. It wasn't sin, not yet, but something the strict walls of the convent could never contain. When their hands brushed accidentally, Beatriz blushed deeply, and Sister Augustina saw it, a flicker of human fire beneath layers of sacred restraint. That night, she did what her conscience demanded. She reported everything to Mother Catalina. The reaction was immediate and merciless. Miguel was dismissed from his duties at once and forbidden to come within 100 meters of the convent. When Beatriz learned of his dismissal, she broke down completely for the first time since her arrival. Tears streamed down her face as she cried out in the refectory, "You see sin where there is only Christian kindness. Miguel is an honest man. He only did his job." Mother Catalina replied in her calm, implacable tone, "My daughter, the purity of Christ's brides cannot be compromised, not even by the appearance of temptation. Reflect on your calling. Before you take vows you may not be ready to keep." That moment marked the beginning of what would later be known as the dark days of October. The atmosphere in the convent grew heavy. Prayers sounded hollow. Silence felt oppressive, and even the air seemed to carry the weight of something unholy approaching. Beatriz had changed. Her once clear, melodious voice now trembled during the chants. Her devotion sounded like despair, and often, during prayers, she would clutch her chest as if her heart were being torn apart from within. Sister Maria del Carmen, whose friendship with Beatriz had become a concern for the convent's authorities, tried to reach out to her again. She found Beatriz in the cloister courtyard, sitting motionless by the fountain, her reflection trembling in the water surface. "Sister," Maria whispered, sitting gently beside her, "your soul seems burdened beyond what any penance could heal. Is there something you can share with me? Perhaps together we might find peace in prayer." Beatriz took a long moment before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was so faint that Maria had to lean in to hear. "Maria, have you ever felt your soul being torn between what you know is right and what feels inevitable?" The question froze her. Maria del Carmen had never doubted her vocation. She entered the convent out of genuine faith, never questioning the church's authority. "I'm not sure I understand," she said softly. "Do you mean doubts about faith?" Beatriz looked at her with unsettling clarity. "I mean realizing that the people we trust to guide our souls can use that trust to cause harm. That the vows of purity and obedience can become chains, not to God, but to those who claim to speak in His name." Before Maria could respond, the sound of soft footsteps interrupted them. It was Sister Esperanza, appearing from behind the archway with her usual cold composure. "Sister Beatriz," she said, her tone sweet but heavy with threat, "the Mother Superior requests your presence." Immediately, that meeting would become the turning point. From that moment forward, nothing would ever be the same. That night, long after the convent's bells had called the sisters to silence, another meeting took place, secret and far more dangerous. In the Mother Superior's chamber sat Fray Domingo, pale and sweating under the candlelight, and across from him, Mother Catalina, her face expressionless but her eyes sharp as a blade. "Reverend Mother," he began, his voice trembling, "I bring information gained through confession. I would not break the sacred seal, unless I feared for the spiritual safety of the entire community." Catalina leaned forward slowly, her crucifix glinting in the dim light. "Continue, Father. When the welfare of souls is at stake, discretion must yield to duty." What Fray Domingo confessed that night would seal Beatriz's fate. He claimed that the young novice was not only developing inappropriate feelings for the expelled carpenter, Miguel Herrera, but also harboring heretical thoughts about the church itself. During confession, he said, wringing his hands, she questioned the validity of sacraments performed by priests who do not live as they preach. She even suggested that a woman might possess a purer connection to the divine than a man bound by vows he does not honor. A shiver ran down Catalina's spine. In 17th century New Spain, even the faintest hint of heresy could bring the full wrath of the Inquisition, not just upon the accused, but upon the entire convent. "What accusations exactly?" Catalina asked, her voice cold, controlled. Fray Domingo's knuckles turned white as he clenched his hands. "She has implied that some confessors use the Holy Sacrament to obtain gratifications beyond the spiritual, that the power we hold over women's souls can corrupt even the most devout among us." The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls like the voice of judgment itself. Mother Catalina finally spoke, her tone sharp as steel. "And do you believe these words have any foundation in truth, Father?" "Of course not," he answered quickly. "They're the lies of a proud, confused girl, a soul poisoned by temptation. The devil works through her, sowing doubt to weaken our faith." But while he spoke, he avoided Catalina's eyes, and that detail did not go unnoticed. The confession set into motion a chain of decisions that would transform the convent of Santa Clara into a place of dread. Catalina, determined to avoid scandal, devised a plan to silence Beatriz without attracting outside attention. The first step was constant surveillance. Sister Esperanza was instructed to shadow Beatriz at all times, to record her words, her movements, even her gestures. To justify this, Catalina announced that Beatriz had been chosen for special spiritual preparation before her vows. The second step was more subtle. Beatriz was never left alone. During work hours, she was assigned a companion. During prayer, an older sister stayed close behind her. Even during recreation, someone always kept her in sight. But Beatriz, sharp and perceptive, soon understood what was happening. And instead of fear, she felt something new, resolve. That change first showed itself one afternoon in the convent library. Beatriz and Maria del Carmen sat copying old Latin manuscripts under the discreet supervision of Sister Esperanza. As her quill moved across the parchment, Beatriz spoke in a low voice. "Maria, have you noticed how some of these old manuscripts contain passages that are no longer in the modern versions of the same texts?" Distracted, Maria shrugged. "Perhaps the scribes of past centuries made mistakes, ones the church has corrected over time." Beatriz's tone deepened slightly, her words carrying the weight of hidden meaning. "Or perhaps," she said, Those passages were removed because they contained truths that certain authorities found inconvenient. Sister Esperanza pretended to read from her breviary, but her ears sharpened, catching every word. For instance, Beatriz continued softly, "There are references to early Christian communities where women held spiritual authority, where they preached, even led congregations. Isn't it curious that such mentions vanished from later editions?" The air thickened. Neither of the other women dared to respond. The conversation had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. That same evening, during her weekly confession, Beatriz faced Fray Domingo again. But this time, she entered the confessional not as a frightened novice, but as a woman who had already seen too much. "Father," she began, her tone calm and deliberate, "I've been reflecting on the nature of sin and purity. May I ask you something theological?" Fray Domingo tensed immediately. "Of course, my child. Speak." "I've been studying the lives of the holy martyrs," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And I noticed that many of them died defending their purity, not from pagans, but from men of authority. Some of them were priests or rulers who used faith as a weapon. Doesn't that strike you as ironic, Father?" Inside the narrow wooden booth, the air grew suffocating. Sweat gathered on Domingo's forehead as he realized where this was going. "Careful, daughter," he said, forcing a smile. "Pride often disguises itself as wisdom. Questioning authority can be a subtle form of sin." Beatriz's reply was steady and fearless. "I understand obedience, Father, but I also understand that blind obedience can become complicity when it hides acts that defy God's law. Tell me, who commits the greater sin? The one who questions corruption, or the one who uses faith to conceal it?" A heavy silence followed, broken only by the sound of their uneven breaths. Finally, Fray Domingo spoke, his tone cold and trembling. "You are treading dangerous ground, child. I will withhold your absolution until you show true repentance for this arrogance." Beatriz didn't hesitate. "Then I cannot repent for seeking the truth. If that is arrogance in your eyes, I accept any penance you impose." When she stepped out of the confessional, both she and the priest knew it. A line had been crossed, and there would be no turning back. The silent war between them had just begun. That same night, after the convent bells rang for Compline, when all should have been silent, a meeting took place in Mother Catalina's private office, one that violated every rule of the cloister. Inside were 3 people: Mother Catalina, Fray Domingo, and an unexpected guest, Don Alfonso Mendoza, Beatriz's father and one of the convent's wealthiest benefactors. He had arrived after dark, summoned by an urgent letter from the Mother Superior. Don Alfonso was a man of 50, broad-shouldered and well-fed, the kind of man used to solving problems with money or threats, sometimes both. As he listened to the account of his daughter's behavior, his expression darkened. When Fray Domingo finished his description of Beatriz's heresies, the father exhaled slowly, then said, "I understand the gravity of this situation, but you must also understand mine. My family has invested heavily in this convent. Not only her dowry, but the renovations, the new chapel, the donations for your order. A scandal involving my daughter would destroy my family's name and the convent's reputation alike." The implication was clear. Silence must be bought, one way or another. Mother Catalina's voice softened, but her eyes remained cold. "We have no wish for scandal, Don Alfonso, only for peace and discipline. But your daughter's influence grows dangerous. She questions authority, infects others with doubt. We must ensure she is guided elsewhere." Don Alfonso leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his belly. "And what exactly do you suggest?" It was Fray Domingo who spoke next, his tone calm, almost too calm. "There is a convent in Guatemala," he said, "a place of perpetual silence. The sisters there have taken vows never to speak, not even to one another. A transfer could be arranged, presented as an honor, a missionary appointment, perhaps, a chance to serve God among the native people." Mother Catalina nodded. Yes, she will take her final vows here, as planned, on the 23rd of October. Then, 2 days later, she will depart for Guatemala. All the paperwork will be completed, all obligations fulfilled, and she will vanish from the world quietly. Don Alfonso's lips curved into a polite, humorless smile. "A wise solution," he said. "My family will, of course, support this new mission generously." The deal was made, but there was one listener none of them knew about. In the silence above them, Sister Maria del Carmen lay awake in her small cell, which happened to be located directly above the Mother Superior's office. Through the cracks in the wooden floorboards, she had overheard enough of their conversation to understand the truth, and it froze her blood. Beatriz was not being disciplined. She was being erased. The next morning, Maria watched her friend during breakfast, the silence of the refectory broken only by the scrape of spoons and the echo of prayers. When the opportunity came, she slipped a folded piece of parchment under Beatriz's wooden bowl. It contained only one line, written in faint ink: "Garden after Vespers by the well." Beatriz read the note without changing her expression, but Maria saw her hands tense around her spoon. That day seemed endless. Each toll of the convent bell sounded heavier than the last. When evening came, the sisters gathered for Vespers, their voices rising in solemn chant. But even their hymns sounded hollow, as though the stones themselves sensed the discord brewing inside their walls. Beatriz stood in her usual place among the novices, her voice strangely firm, clear, almost defiant. Mother Catalina, watching from above, felt an unease she couldn't explain. When the prayers ended and the sisters returned to their cells, Beatriz quietly slipped away toward the garden. The garden was small and secluded, bordered by old stone walls and overgrown vines. Near the far corner stood an ancient well, its stones slick with moss, its depth lost in darkness. There, waiting in the shadows, was Sister Maria del Carmen. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she spoke in a whisper. "Beatriz, listen to me carefully. Last night I heard them, the Mother Superior, Fray Domingo, and your father. They're planning to send you to a convent in Guatemala, a place of silence. Once you're there, no one will ever hear from you again. No letters, no visits, nothing. You'll disappear." Beatriz stood motionless, her face unreadable, her gaze fixed on the water below the well. After a long silence, she asked softly, "Maria, do you think Miguel Herrera still lives in the village?" The question took Maria by surprise. I suppose so. Why do you ask?" Beatriz turned toward her, and in that moment her expression changed, calm, but with a strange, dangerous determination. "Because if they're going to accuse me of losing my purity over a man, then perhaps it's time their accusation became truth." Maria gasped. "Beatriz, no. You can't mean to escape. If you're caught, They already condemned me for sins I never committed." Beatriz interrupted, her voice steady. "At least this time, I'll be punished for choices that were mine." The distant toll of the bell called the sisters to Compline. The two women hurried back toward the cloister, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone path. As they parted ways, Maria whispered one last plea. "Beatriz, think carefully. Even if you run, where will you go? Your family will disown you. The church will hunt you. And Miguel, how can you know he would risk everything for you?" Beatriz looked at her friend with calm certainty. "There are worse fates than excommunication, Maria. I would rather face God's anger for following my heart than live knowing I allowed men to destroy my soul in his name. That night, while the convent slept, Beatriz remained awake in her small cell. The moonlight cast silver bars across her floor, real bars, and the shadow of the iron ones on her window. She had noticed months ago that one of those bars had loosened in the damp wall. Using a small nail she'd once found during the repairs, she had been slowly prying it loose, not with the intention to flee, but as a small act of defiance, a way to remind herself she still had power over something. Now, that tiny act would become her salvation. With painstaking care, she worked the bar free, widening the opening just enough for her slender body to slip through. Beyond the window lay the back courtyard, bordered by a 4-meter wall of volcanic stone, and along it, a thick vine that had grown for a century, climbing toward the moon. But before she could escape, there was one last thing she had to do. Tell the truth. For the next 2 hours, by the light of a stolen candle, Beatriz wrote what would later become one of the most infamous documents in the convent's history, a letter addressed to her parents, but meant for a much wider audience. Her hand trembled, yet her words were precise. My beloved parents, when you read these lines, I will have made a choice that brings you shame, but is the only way to save my soul from the corruption that festers within these walls. I have learned that spiritual power can be corrupted as easily as temporal power, and that blind obedience can become the vessel of that corruption. I cannot, in good conscience, bind myself to a life where faith is used as a mask for human weakness. She described in careful detail the way Fray Domingo had manipulated the younger sisters during confession, using guilt as a weapon, twisting their devotion into fear. And at the end, she wrote, "If this act condemns me, then let it be so. I trust that God, who sees all hearts clearly, will understand my motives better than any earthly judge." When she finished, she placed the letter inside her breviary, marking it with Psalm 51, "Have mercy on me, O God." Then, as the candle burned low, she prepared to leave the convent forever. It was the cold, breathless hour before dawn, when even the crickets had fallen silent, that Beatriz Mendoza decided to flee. The convent slept in perfect stillness. Only the faint drip of water from the cloister fountain broke the silence, echoing through the dark corridors like a heartbeat. Beatriz slipped from her cell barefoot, her black veil wrapped tightly around her shoulders. In one hand, she carried a small pouch containing a rosary, the key to the chapel, and a few coins she had secretly kept from her embroidery work. In the other, she clutched her breviary, the one containing the letter that would expose everything. Each step she took was measured and soundless. The old stones beneath her feet were cold, and her breath hung in the air as mist. When she reached the side cloister, she paused, listening. No sound. The night watch sister had likely fallen asleep again, lulled by the monotony of her duty. Beatriz took one last breath and slipped through the half-open door leading to the outer courtyard. The courtyard stretched beneath the moon like a sea of shadows. The vines that climbed the walls swayed slightly in the night breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence again. Beatriz hurried to the base of the wall, where the thick vine she had studied for months twisted upward like a living rope. Gripping the stones with raw fingers, she began to climb. Halfway up, her foot slipped. A chunk of loose stone tumbled down, striking the ground with a hollow clack. She froze, heart pounding, listening for movement. None came. Her arms burned with effort, but she did not stop until she reached the top. For a brief moment, she stood there, the convent behind her, the dark expanse of the valley before her. It was as though she stood between two worlds, one ruled by faith, the other by freedom. Without hesitation, she dropped down the other side, landing hard but steady on her feet. The earth was damp and cold beneath her. She whispered one word, "Amen," and began to run. The village of Oaxaca slept under a veil of fog. Beatriz moved through its narrow alleys like a shadow, keeping close to the walls. When she finally reached the outskirts, the sky had begun to pale faintly in the east. Her destination was an abandoned chapel known as San Geronimo de los Olivos, a small stone ruin once used by hermits. It stood half a league away, surrounded by olive trees and silence. That was where Miguel Herrera worked as caretaker after his dismissal from the convent's repairs. She knew he stayed there sometimes, repairing the old building in exchange for lodging. As she approached, her steps slowed. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Someone was inside. Beatriz hesitated for a heartbeat, her hand trembling as she reached the door. Then she knocked, softly twice. From within came a cautious voice. "Who's there?" "Miguel, it's me." A pause, then the sound of hurried footsteps, the bolts sliding back, and the door opening just enough of the flickering firelight to reveal her face. Miguel's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sister Beatriz? By God, what are you doing here? If they find you." She stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her. Her breath came in short, shaking bursts. "They already planned to send me away," she said, her voice breaking. "Far from here. Somewhere I would never be heard from again." Miguel stared at her in silence, torn between fear and compassion. Then he guided her to the bench by the fire, wrapping his own cloak around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. "They'll call it blasphemy. They'll call it sin." Beatriz looked at him, truly looked for the first time without fear or pretense. "Everything they've ever called sin has been what makes us human." Her words hung in the air, trembling like the flame that lit them. Hours passed as they spoke, about faith, about fear, about freedom. Miguel listened, unable to reconcile the holy image he once saw in her with the woman before him. Brave, wounded, and unyielding. When the first light of dawn spilled across the cracked walls, Beatriz stood and said quietly, "I'll leave when the sun rises. I only needed to tell someone the truth. After that, they can say whatever they want." But Miguel stepped forward and caught her hand. "No, you can't go back. Not now. Not ever. You've crossed a line they'll never forgive. They'll destroy you, Beatriz." "Then help me leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Take me anywhere. Puebla, Veracruz, anywhere but here." Miguel hesitated, then nodded. "There's an old mule trail that leads through the ravine. If we leave before sunrise, we might reach the next village by noon. But you'll need to travel disguised." He handed her a rough woolen shawl and a peasant's hat. When she put them on, she no longer looked like the novice of Santa Clara. She looked like any young woman fleeing poverty or war. "Once we reach San Pedro," Miguel said, "you can find a ship headed south. Guatemala, maybe even farther. You could start anew." Beatriz looked at him with faint sadness. "And you?" He smiled, a small, weary smile. "I'll say I never saw you." They left the chapel before the sun fully rose, walking through the fields while the mist still clung to the grass. For a time, silence reigned between them, until the distant toll of bells shattered it. Beatriz froze. It was the convent's bell, the alarm. They had discovered her absence. "They know," she whispered. Miguel took her hand. "Then we run." And so they did, through the fields, through the fog, toward the mountains that seemed to promise safety. But fate, as always, was listening, because that same morning, Mother Catalina and Fray Domingo had already sent men to search the surrounding villages, guards loyal to the church and to the Mendoza family's honor. By nightfall, their pursuit would begin. The sun rose over the mountains of Oaxaca, spilling gold over the misty valleys. A beautiful morning that hid a cruel truth. By the time the convent discovered Beatriz's escape, she and Miguel Herrera had already crossed the river and entered the foothills of the Sierra Madre. But their lead was fragile. Behind them, riders had already been dispatched, 2 guards from the city and a friar carrying written orders from Mother Catalina. To the outside world, these orders described a runaway novice in spiritual distress. In truth, they were sent to retrieve her alive or dead, before word of her accusations could spread. As Beatriz and Miguel climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and cold. The silence between them had turned heavy, not from lack of words, but from the weight of what they both knew. At one point, they stopped near a stream to rest. Beatriz knelt beside the water, washing the dirt from her face. For a brief moment, her reflection appeared calm, almost peaceful, until she looked up and whispered, "Miguel, do you believe God forgives those who flee his house?" Miguel crouched beside her, his voice low. "I don't know what he forgives, Beatriz, but I know he never asked you to live in fear." She smiled faintly, that same delicate, defiant smile that had once brightened the cold corridors of the convent. "Then maybe he led me here," she said softly, "to finally see the truth." They continued walking until dusk, when the forest thickened and the trail narrowed into a winding path bordered by cliffs. Miguel found a small cave hidden among the rocks and lit a fire. Beatriz sat beside him, staring into the flames. Her hands trembled as she held the breviary, the letter still hidden inside. "This book," she whispered, "is the only proof of what they've done. If they catch me, they'll burn it and say I was mad." Miguel looked at her, torn between admiration and dread. "Then we can't let them catch you. Tomorrow, I'll go ahead and find a wagon heading north. Once you reach Veracruz, you'll be safe." Beatriz looked into his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to reach out, her fingers brushing his cheek. "Safe," she murmured. "I've forgotten what that feels like." He took her hand, holding it gently. Neither spoke again for a long time. Only the fire crackled between them, a small, fragile warmth in a world that had turned cold. By dawn, the riders had reached the first village. The villagers told them a man and a young woman had passed the night before, heading toward the mountains. The friar leading the search, Fray Domingo, smiled grimly. "She thinks she can escape God," he muttered, "but sin always leaves footprints." His horse snorted, its breath steaming in the cold air. "Move out," he ordered. "We find them before nightfall." That same morning, Miguel and Beatriz resumed their journey, unaware that the hunters were already closing in. The path wound through steep ravines and dense forests. Each step was harder, the road more treacherous. By midday, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley. The wind howled across the rocks, and from that height, they could see the faint line of riders moving in the distance. Beatriz's breath caught in her throat. "They found us." Miguel cursed under his breath. "We'll take the upper pass. They can't ride horses there." They turned off the trail and began climbing, but the ground was loose, the slope steep. At one point, Beatriz slipped, her foot catching on a root. Miguel grabbed her just in time, pulling her close. For a brief second, they stood face to face, breathless, hearts pounding. Then Beatriz whispered, "If they catch me, don't let them take me back." Miguel shook his head fiercely. "Don't talk like that. We'll make it." But Beatriz's eyes, calm, distant, said she already knew how the story would end. By late afternoon, thunder rolled over the mountains. Dark clouds gathered, swallowing the sky. The rain came suddenly, cold, furious, blinding. They sought shelter under a rocky ledge, soaked to the bone. The fire they tried to light sputtered and died in the wind. Beatriz shivered violently. Miguel wrapped his arms around her, trying to keep her warm, but she looked past him toward the valley below, where flashes of lightning revealed riders advancing through the storm. "They're close," she whispered. Miguel followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Then we go higher. There's an abandoned hermitage near the ridge. If we reach it, we can wait until morning." But before they could move, a shout echoed from below. Harsh, commanding, unmistakable. "By order of the Holy Church, stop!" The sound of hooves and the glint of torches pierced the rain. They were surrounded. Miguel drew the small knife he carried for work. Useless against armed men, but it was all he had. Beatriz stepped in front of him, her voice breaking through the storm. "Please, no more blood." The riders emerged from the trees. 3 soldiers, and behind them, Fray Domingo, his face illuminated by lightning. He dismounted slowly, raising a trembling hand. "Sister Beatriz," he said, his tone both calm and venomous, "you have brought shame upon your vows, upon your family, and upon the church. But it is not too late. Surrender, and God may yet forgive you." Beatriz's answer was clear, her voice steady despite the storm. "God does not need you to forgive me, Father." Domingo's expression twisted. "Blasphemy." "Truth," she replied. "You used his name to justify your cruelty, to cage souls that were never yours to keep." Miguel stepped beside her, knife still raised. "You'll have to go through me first." Domingo's gaze hardened. He gestured to the soldiers. "Take them." What happened next would become part of legend, whispered through generations as the tragedy of the runaway nun. A soldier lunged. Miguel fought back fiercely, but a blow from a rifle sent him sprawling. As 2 men held him down, Beatriz screamed his name, her voice tearing through the storm. Fray Domingo advanced slowly, his face distorted by rage and triumph. "You defied the church," he hissed. "You spread heresy, corrupted a man of faith." But before he could finish, Beatriz seized the only thing she had left, her breviary. She threw it at his feet, shouting, "Then read the truth you fear." The small book fell open in the mud, the letter visible, the one that exposed everything. For an instant, Fray Domingo hesitated. Then, with a furious cry, he snatched it up and hurled it into the fire burning nearby. The flames devoured the pages instantly. Beatriz screamed, breaking free of the soldier's grasp. She ran toward the edge of the cliff, where the rain had turned the ground to slippery clay. "Beatriz, no!" Miguel shouted, struggling to rise. She turned one last time, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes shining with something between sorrow and peace. "They can take my body," she said, her voice barely audible through the storm, "but my soul is already free." And before anyone could stop her, she stepped backward into the void. The storm drowned out the soldiers' shouts. Only Miguel's voice echoed through the canyon, a cry of pure anguish that no one would ever forget. By the time the rain ceased, dawn had returned, calm, indifferent. The soldiers searched for her body for 3 days, but it was never found. Only her rosary was recovered, tangled in the branches below the cliff. The day after the tragedy, the convent bells rang in mourning, not for a death, but for a fallen soul. The official record written by Mother Catalina de Los Angeles stated that Sister Beatriz Mendoza, afflicted by hysteria and spiritual temptation, threw herself from the mountain in an act of despair. Her name was stricken from the convent's rolls. Her cell was sealed. Her few belongings were burned, all except her rosary, which was locked in a small chest beside the Mother Superior's desk. The Mendoza family, desperate to protect their honor, accepted the story without question. They paid the convent a generous donation for silence, and Beatriz's name was never spoken again in polite society. Miguel Herrera, broken and accused of abduction, was imprisoned for a year, then vanished without a trace after his release. Some said he left Oaxaca. Others whispered that he returned to the mountains and never came down. As for Fray Domingo, he was transferred to another province, where he continued his duties until his sudden death 2 years later. Witnesses said that, in his final days, he would wake in the middle of the night screaming Beatriz's name, claiming to see her standing in the shadows, her habit drenched in rain. For more than 3 centuries, the story of Sister Beatriz was buried beneath silence, hidden behind layers of devotion, fear, and guilt. The convent of Santa Clara continued to function, its halls filled with prayer, its archives sealed and forgotten. Until the year 2024, during renovations ordered by the local diocese, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind the altar of the old chapel, a space no more than half a meter deep, sealed by a stone slab marked with a small cross. Inside were 3 objects, perfectly preserved despite the centuries: a rusted iron nail, a fragment of burned parchment, and a small wooden rosary, the same one recorded in the convent's inventory in 1698. But there was something else. Wrapped in layers of decayed cloth was a small manuscript, written in the same careful hand that once filled the convent's ledgers. The text was faint but legible. It began with these words: I, Catalina de Los Angeles, Mother Superior of Santa Clara, write this not as confession, but as atonement. What followed shook the historians and the church alike. Mother Catalina revealed that, after Beatriz's fall, she had gone to the mountains to retrieve the body, not out of pity, but to ensure silence. But what she found there defied everything she believed. According to her account, she and the soldiers discovered no body, only torn branches and footprints that led deeper into the ravine. They followed them for several hours until they reached a narrow cave hidden behind a waterfall. Inside, they found a fire still burning, and near it, signs that someone had recently been alive: a shawl, a broken rosary bead, and a piece of parchment stained with blood. And on the wall of that cave, written in ashes and candle soot, were the words, "Truth is the only faith that never dies." Catalina wrote that, in that moment, something inside her broke. She ordered the search to end, claiming Beatriz's body had been lost to the river. But in secret, she returned to the cave every year on the same day, October 23rd. Her final line read, "If her soul survived, then perhaps it prays not for vengeance, but for our forgiveness." After the discovery of the manuscript, the church officially reopened the case of Sister Beatriz Mendoza. Historians examined the letter fragments, the burned breviary, and the cave itself, which was found exactly where the confession described it. Local climbers confirmed the presence of faint writings on the rock, nearly erased by time and water, but still visible under ultraviolet light. And among them, one phrase stood out clearly, carved by hand centuries ago: "Forgive them, Lord. They knew exactly what they did." Today, the convent of Santa Clara still stands. Visitors who enter a chapel during the evening say they sometimes hear faint weeping near the old altar, or see a flicker of candlelight from the sealed cell where Sister Beatriz once lived. And on the night of October 23rd, when the wind passes through the cloister arches, some claim to hear a whisper carried on the air: "There are no walls in heaven." If you have listened this far, you now know the truth that was buried for more than 300 years. The story of a nun who defied power in the name of her own soul and paid the ultimate price for freedom. So the next time you hear the bells of an old convent ringing after midnight, remember her, because sometimes faith survives not in the silence of obedience, but in the voice of one who dared to speak.